Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Sorry, there was some issue with my Zoom. Nothing serious, just had to go out and come in again.
Morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Carol. Hi, Shell. Hi, Maddie. Gary, are you here?
We leave in 10 days.
Okay.
And we are in New Jersey for 4 days, and then we go out to
Oh, that's right.
California.
And then you're off again.
Then we're off again. So just enough time to unpack and repack.
What's in California?
I'll have a meeting out there the second week of California, and I have a cousin in the LA area that I'll visit with
Oh,
while
nice.
we're there. And then we're going to do some sightseeing.
Sounds good.
So we finally get home at the beginning of June.
We'll see you then.
Yes.
So I hope everyone had a chance to look at the readings and in particular to watch the YouTube.
It was really good.
Yeah. Yehuda Kurtzer is a brilliant guy. Like, I just don't know how he packs in so much knowledge. And I just find him incredibly insightful. So just to kind of review the topic, it's a topic that actually has been under discussion for quite some time. And I see it particularly because of my age and when I grew up. So I'm born in 59, growing up to the 60s. The 60s, of course, is when we first began to talk about the Shoah in much greater detail. I think, and I don't know, you would have to read historians and sociologists who would be able to give you a greater picture of this, or better context, but it seems to me that one of the things that allowed people to talk about the Shoah was the Eichmann trial. First of all, the shock and wonderful chutzpah of the Israelis to find Eichmann and to bring him to justice. And of course, it's the same time the rise of ethnicism, where people were suddenly very proud of their ethnic backgrounds. It was the time of Black Power. It was the time when Jews were starting to feel much more comfortable in American society. And so you think of shows like Fiddler on the Roof, which believe it or not everyone loved. And suddenly, as Jews were beginning to talk about themselves and the world was beginning to talk about itself, the Shoah suddenly became an important topic of conversation, not just among, by the way, because in addition to the rise of ethnic identity and the Eichmann trial, there was also Vatican II in 1964, where the church absolved the Jews, the killing of Christ. Suddenly Christianity in the 60s began to look at itself. It's also the death of God theology at this time, where Christianity began to take a look at itself and say, wait a minute, we may not have liked the Jews, but look at the Shoah. Look what happened. And even though some Christians are still uncomfortable with the notion, as a course on a program by the Boston Public Education, Boston Public TV, named it in one of their episodes in their famous series on anti-Semitism, From the Cross to the Swastika. There was no question that centuries of Christian anti-Judaism was the fertile ground for the Shoah. So even Christians were beginning to talk about the Shoah and to come to grips with what had happened. And growing up in the 60s, suddenly everyone's talking about the Shoah. And as I moved into the 70s and old enough to really start studying about the Shoah and being at Jewish summer camp, I started at Ramah in 1970. There was a lot of Holocaust education. And Holocaust education at that time was very much talking about the horrors of the Shoah. You would watch films such as Night and Fog, which is one of the classic films about the Shoah, and that shows all the horrors, the piles of bodies, the bulldozing to bury those bodies, and the results of Nazi experiments, a lot of really terrible things. And there was also a sense that, why are we Jewish? Because of the Shoah. We have to be Jewish. To use Fackenheim's term, it's the 314th commandment. Sorry, 613th.
614.
Yeah, 614. I think I said it right the first time. I'm just starting my coffee, so then you'll have to forgive me. And we can't give Hitler a posthumous victory. And of course, people are beginning to get excited about Israel. Israel has been around now as we move into the 60s and certainly into the 70s. It's been around longer than 10 years. And, it survived the War for Liberation. It survived the Sinai campaign. And then 67 was another major watershed year for Jewry, when we weren't sure there wasn't going to be another Holocaust. The Arabs were saying, we're going to push the Jews into the sea. And despite all of the Arab armies talking about destroying Israel and them all joining in, within 6 days, Israel had won. And suddenly Israel was now a modern country. It was no longer a third world country. And Jews just had this incredible sense of pride. And Israel was, beloved of everyone, at least for a couple of months. And we had large numbers of Jews making Aliyah. Of course, during the 60s, as we talked about the Shoah, we also had the rise of the Jewish Defense League, JDL, Kahana's group. The Jews were not going to sit down and take it from anyone anymore. As time went on, and I saw this in my education, but as well as I became an educator, is suddenly we're talking about the Shoah a little bit differently. Judaism began to recognize that simply talking about the Shoah was not necessarily the way to ensure Jewish continuity and Jewish identity. It used to be that almost every UJA mission ended up in Yad Vashem. We're gonna get the maximum number of dollars if we end our mission on this incredibly powerful experience of going to the Museum of the Shoah and remembering this terrible event. And that wasn't working quite the same way. And it wasn't just about Jews suffering and Jews dying, but Jews succeeding. We were looking at Israel as a remarkable country, and we couldn't just look at the people who were trying to destroy Israel. And the way we taught about the Shoah began to change. And of course, we also have the reality of a different generation growing up. I mean, I'm a generation that grew up after World War II. So World War II, although very much known to me and very much part of my life, not in the same way as for people just a few years older. And in fact, in my family, we didn't have any Holocaust survivors. My family had mostly come to America before World War II. In fact, only one of my grandfathers, neither of whom I knew, had come from Russia. So my family was very American, and I didn't have it immediately in front of me, whereas, a number of my friends were children of survivors, where their grandparents were survivors, or aunts and uncles. So Jewish education began to shift and began to change, and we're talking about living Jewry. And it created kind of two ways of looking at Judaism. We look at Judaism as mostly from the eyes of the Shoah. And on one hand, we can't do that. First of all, we're still the generation immediately after the Shoah. We still have survivors here. You cannot escape from the Shoah. It's right there. And of course, with 67, for all the pride in Israel, it was scary just before the war. Not something that I was 8, so I didn't really remember all of the prelude to the war, only learned of it afterwards. But people were really scared. And then, of course, came 1982 and the Yom Kippur War. And Israel, which had been on an incredible high, and this tremendous sense of confidence, as it turned out, overweening confidence, was suddenly shaken back into reality by the Yom Kippur War. And it was at that time that when, Israelis felt a little bit more insecure. And at the same time, we're doubling down a little bit on the territories that we had taken during the 67 war. We also had the fall of labor and the rise of a right-wing government in the form of Menachem Begin. And David Hartman, also because he lost his son-in-law in the, let me take a step back. So, things were changing in Israel. And then what we have, there was still more pride in the Jew with the rescue from Entebbe, but then we had the first Lebanon War. And I remember one Israeli telling me that in all the previous wars, Milchemet HaShichror, the War for Liberation, the War for Independence, the Sinai Campaign, 67, and 82, the Yom Kippur War. Sorry,
70.
I got that wrong. 72. I keep saying 82. 82 is, we're moving into Lebanon. 72 is Yom Kippur. And he said in all of those wars, the people of Israel went to war. But in Lebanon, the state of Israel went into war. That was a war that has been talked about as Israel's Vietnam. It just shook everybody up. And there were a lot of Israelis that were not at all happy with the war. On one hand, I don't think anyone had problems with creating the buffer zone, that initial zone that Israel conquered in Lebanon because of all the terrorist attacks and terrorist bombings. But then they pushed forward. And they embroiled themselves in the civil war going on in Lebanon. They tried to destroy the PLO, which did not work because the PLO escaped. And there were a lot of recriminations. There was a lot of disappointments. And suddenly, people were concerned about Israeli power. Israelis were concerned about Israeli power. We just went in, and look what happened. It was a mess. So that's when David Hartman writes his essay, Auschwitz and Sinai. He lost a son in the son-in-law in the Yom Kippur War. Sorry, in the Lebanon War. Thank you. And he began reflecting on what is Israel all about. Who should we be as a nation? And he sets up these two paradigms of Auschwitz and Sinai. And even before I get into that, there's, I think, the very concise and good comments by Dr. Edna Friedberg, who had done a
Mhm.
piece for JTS. And so talk to me, tell me, some of your thoughts, some of your reactions, your feelings.
Yeah, what struck me in the video was the failure of Sinai, or what he called the failure of Sinai.
Mhm.
I just never thought of it that way. That it was just an impossible thing for the Jews to attain. That we couldn't go up to the mountain, we couldn't stay on that mountain. It was for Moses, but even he had trouble with it. And
Yeah.
related to the people afterwards. And even though I think when he mentioned the kingdom of priests, I always assumed it was kind of a lofty thing, a lofty term. But he said, what was the job of the priests? It was to serve the people. They didn't own anything. They didn't have anything. And there were just so many points of why Sinai failed. And it just seemed like a revelation to me of a different sort,
Yeah.
that we couldn't live up
There's
to
no
it.
soap in the
And
dishwasher. Is it
What?
supposed to be- Is there supposed to be soap in the dishwasher?
Yeah,
There's no
So-
soap in there. Was there supposed to be?
So,
it just, yeah. And he also said, it shouldn't be one or the other, not Auschwitz versus Sinai, that we need a little of both, but definitely not one or the other.
so again, what was so brilliant, first of all, any comments about Hartman himself, the metaphors that he sets up?
There are two polar extremes that are not satisfying the way he sets them up, certainly. But he does raise in his paper serious issues on how neither one of these would be effective over the long run. And
Yeah.
That's it's a real problem.
What struck me about Hartman's piece, and again, partially because of my age and my experiences in Jewish education and thoughts about Jewish identity, is how much the paradigm of Auschwitz was so powerful in my early years. Or not necessarily powerful in me. As I said, for me, the Shoah was obviously a very meaningful and powerful experience of the Jewish people, and it was an important historical memory. And the weight of Auschwitz, symbolizing the entire Shoah, certainly was not lost. But it didn't touch me any more than really the rise of Israel. My very influential teacher in Hebrew school had fought in the Irgun. So when we would watch film strips on Israel, remember those things? We would, when we would hear about Israel, it was not some distant land. This is where he had grown up. I mean, his mother had escaped from Romania during the war. And he was raised in Israel. And he could look at these places and say, this is what was there, this was what was there, here we did this, here we did that. And Israel was a very living space for me. And he and his family spoke Hebrew. So Hebrew to me was always a spoken language. My rabbi spoke to him in Hebrew. And then, of course, I went to Ramah. And I'm in a Hebrew speaking camp, and we have a mishlachat, we have a whole contingent from Israel. So, Israel was not, and again, going to Ramah after 67 and, my beginning to understand these things at my teenage years in the 70s, suddenly, Israel was always the greater pull on me personally. So, I always thought about how can we only talk about Auschwitz? How can that be our only metaphor for Israel, for Jewish existence and Jewish continuity? So I struggled with that personally, but then certainly the Jewish community began struggling with it as we saw that it just wasn't as effective for developing Jewish identity. And of course, now if you go on a Federation mission, they do not conclude at Yad Vashem. They conclude with much more positive experiences of Israel. And I mean, Yad Vashem is still on the itinerary, and it absolutely has to be. And it's still a major focus, but it doesn't have the same
It isn't stressed the same way.
It isn't stressed in the same way.
We visited Auschwitz in 1972, as it turned out, about a week or two before the Olympic massacre.
Oh, wow.
So our timing was weird.
We visited where?
Auschwitz.
No, we didn't. You didn't. No. We didn't visit Auschwitz.
So it was.
Okay, you
You made
visited
a mistake,
Auschwitz.
Gary. Auschwitz in Poland, it's not Germany. Dachau.
Well, either way, Auschwitz or Dachau, to go to a concentration camp, and then a week later to be in the environs and experience the Olympic massacre. That, I can't even begin to imagine the impact of the juxtaposition of those experiences.
Well, we were home by then, but still. We didn't get to Israel, my Ramah trip, until after the Entebbe hostages had landed, but we did arrive the day after. So, that experience was very much part of our experience in Israel. And you can't, for us, we can't help but think like, oh my God, But of course, even the Entebbe experience, that to some extent is like, well, Auschwitz can't happen again because we have Israel, and we have the Israeli Defense Forces, who are there to protect Israel and save Jews, and there is a safe haven for Jews. But there seemed to be an imbalance in the way everybody always talked about Auschwitz, and they didn't talk about signing. Who are we as a Jewish people? What are our values as a Jewish people? It's our value is not dying. Our value is living. If anything, Judaism is a religion of life. That's why, and I mentioned this before, Harold Kushner in his book, why am I suddenly blanking on the book?
When bad things happen.
No,
to
not when bad things happen to good people.
the life,
It's to life. Yeah, it wasn't in Hebrew, but to life, and he talks about coming out of the Holocaust Museum and then wondering, well, where's the other museum? This is talking about Jews dying, but what about 4,000 years of Jewish history and culture and wisdom? And what is Judaism about? We just talked about all the rules of purity and impurity in the Bible. Actually, we're coming up to a little bit more. We're still in that topic to some extent with this week's parasha of Achremot, and then in Emor it talks about the Kohanim. But biblical Judaism is about life. What are the things that distance one from God? Things that are connected with death. Our tradition is about celebrating life. And so Professor Kurtzer mentions this, and all of us in Jewish education have talked about this, the so-called lacrimose theory of Jewish history is that Judaism is all suffering. And, that's just simply not true. And yet so many people carry that. And we have to start thinking about Judaism itself. What do we stand for? So he brought up, and after the Lebanon War, he brought up this and became a major theme in his thinking about, who are we as Jews? And having made Aliyah, who are we as Israelis? What do we stand for? What are we supposed to represent? What should be our values? How do we behave? It's not, and I think Kurtzer just beautifully unpacks those two metaphors of Sinai and Zion, as Carol mentioned, pokes holes in each of them, but really unpacks them to understand, how we move from a feeling of us versus them to this is who we are, which I think is, that's has always been a very, since I studied at Hartman, has been a very, very important message for me, and hopefully something I've tried to convey from time to time. Any other reactions to the readings, the YouTube?
Well, in Edna Friedberg's remarks said, and I was surprised that I forget the year, but there was a Pew study, and that 73% of Jews said that remembering the Holocaust was the most important part of being Jewish, which surprised me. Because, I wake up every morning, unless it's, Crystal Nacht or Yom HaShoah, not thinking about the Holocaust, but thinking of, okay, what do I do with the milchik fork that I put in the fleishik drawer or something like that? I mean, I don't know, unless we're actually childhood survivors, how much we think of the Holocaust as the most important part of being Jewish. It just doesn't affect my life personally that way. But then again, my grandparents came here early in the 20th century. So even though there were people in the family that were killed, but I didn't know them, and my grandparents never talked about them, sisters and brothers that were lost. So it just didn't affect me that way. But
I should
yeah.
also say that, the Pew research findings were certainly, not necessarily comfortable for many of us. On the other hand, we also have to realize that it's talking about the larger Jewish community. And when we think about people who do not have necessarily a connection to Judaism as a religion, their Jewish identity is much more cultural, which so many people claim that is their approach to Judaism. They're cultural Jews. They don't feel any kind of religious connection. For many of them, it was indeed the Shoah that somehow motivated them. You can think of, to some extent, the JDL, but that was when we started talking about the Shoah, and we were moving away from the tremendous amount of anti-Semitism that existed. And there was more than a tinge of racism in there. I mean, Kahana was unquestionably a racist, and it was also a time of Jews moving to the suburbs, and it's urban flight, getting away from the blacks that were moving into their neighborhoods. So the JDL, the phenomenon was much more complicated, but it was suddenly the strong Jew was also adopting kind of the Israeli model that we as Jews are strong. It wasn't everybody just going off like sheep to the slaughter. But it's like, we're not going to, never again. Never again. That was the statement. And one didn't have to be part of the JDL to agree with that kind of statement. And to some extent, you had a similar experience in that, or similar expression, I should say, when certain army battalions in Israel would take their oaths or would have their ceremony at the top of Mitzada. I was like, Masada will not fall again. Ignoring the reality of the history that, I'm not sure we all would have agreed with the people at Masada because they were probably fanatics. But the idea that, Jews are not just going to lie down and die and be victims, that was very, very powerful. But the idea of Jew as victim has continued. And it's in the consciousness of the world. I think it was Dara Horn, who just wrote a book, I haven't read yet, unfortunately, like Why the World Loves Dead Jews. And to some extent, we looked at Jews whose connection to Judaism was coming to shul on the high holidays and for Yizkor and Yard Site. We remember dead Jews. It didn't come in Purim and Simchat Torah when Jews were celebrating, for that matter, even Sukkot or Shabbat. But you came, when you wanted to remember dead Jews. And it is kind of true that people are very happy with the Jew as victim and very supportive of the Jew as victim. They've been less supportive, of course, as Israel has been strong. And when Israel steps up to its enemies, then, it's people aren't so happy, which also is true for many other ethnic groups that face all kinds of prejudice. It's like, it's okay, that the blacks are involved, but, they shouldn't get too much power, God forbid. They're these uppity blacks that, so it's not an uncommon racist type of reaction to a group that people don't like. But, it's there seems to be a power in dead Jews. And yet, it's, for many of us, it's no, look who we are, look how we live. And I think that argument is coming around again. It never left us, but I think, and one of the reasons I chose this topic is that, we're still struggling with the us versus them. It's very hard not to look at the world with an Auschwitz type of perspective. The ADL just released its findings that like 217 or 220 was at one of the highest, 2020 had the highest number of anti-Semitic incidents by a long shot in many, many years. And every time we turn around, there's another story about anti-Semitism, whether it's on the college campuses, whether it's a statement that is made by somebody, an outrageous statement. It's, the depictions of Israel, which even for those of us who have very strong objections to many Israeli policies and certain Israeli politicians, there's no question that some of the comments that are made, or many of the comments that are made, are way overboard and deliberately anti-Semitic. So, and then we just had a spate of terrorist attacks in Israel. So it's hard not to maintain that sense of Auschwitz, the us versus them, because it rears its head. And if you watched the video, one of the first questions that Professor Kurtzer received was, well, what about all, it's all fine and nice to talk about Sinai as our model and our aspirational Judaism, big word at Hartman, aspirational Judaism, but what do you do when you deal with the reality? it was very interesting. I don't know if anybody caught parts of the interview between Naftali Bennett and Christiane Amanpour, where she, is saying, questioning him, hard questions, and I don't think he adequately answered all of them. But one of the things he pointed out is that, your whole presentation here is a distortion. You're forgetting the other side that, we just lost 14 people in terrorist attacks. We're constantly dealing with the violence, and in fact, part of the tensions on the Temple Mount, everybody talked about the Israeli soldiers going into the Al-Aqsa Mosque, even though Arab writers had brought in rocks, and they're in their mosque in their shoes. So like, tell me what's, they don't seem to care about their own mosque. And they were the ones who started all of this. I get it, Ricky, take care. But no one picks up on the fact that later in the day, thousands of Muslim pilgrims were able to pray peacefully on the Temple Mount. So, it's tough. And did anyone see the interview? You could find it on YouTube, Christiane Amanpour and Naftali Bennett.
But I didn't see it, but going back to the, I don't know if you say polarization of the Holocaust versus the state of Israel, it may be a combination of both that people are trying to achieve, and it may be easier. I know I shouldn't say easier, but less effort to remember someone that's deceased or dead or died in the Holocaust than it is to maintain an observant Jewish life.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And
I hate to say that though, but it may be
well,
just.
no, I think it's like most Jews identify themselves as cultural Jews.
Yeah.
And they, I would say that, and by the way, Israeli Jews are no different.
No, it was at 70% or secular?
Well, that was in the States. The Pew study was in the States.
No, but I meant when we were in Israel, many, Nancy and I have been there 4 times. I'm sure most of you have been there more than a dozen times. I was always told that there are more secular Israelis than there are observant Israelis. And right? Am I wrong or?
No, I think that's for the large part correct. Sometimes, we use these terms secular, religious, and they don't really work.
Yeah.
There are a lot of secular Jews that are really quite observant. And then, the idea, Israelis come to the United States and they're not observant in any way, shape, or form, but they have to go to Chabad, because that's somehow they see as authentic. And but you're right, the majority of the community is not traditionally observant.
Right.
You can see people riding their bikes on Yom Kippur. I mean, like a long bike ride, they take food with them, and it's it's a whole day. It's wow, nobody's on the roads, this is great. And Shabbat, where will you find most Israelis?
On the beach.
On the beach, yeah. I mean, what else do you do on Shabbat, for God's sakes? Or, you have youth group meetings. It was very funny because I think I had mentioned this before, that Sofim, the Israeli scouts, there was a group that met right next to our dorm, now Machon Shechter, but we were right next to Emek HaMatzleva, the Valley of the Cross. Where, according to Christian tradition, the wood from the cross came from the olive groves that are there. and there's a mosque down, I mean, excuse me, there's a church down there. But, it used to be an olive grove. So it's really quite lovely park-like area, although it's more walkways than a lot of open green. But that would be a great place for the Tzofim to be outside. And if you wanted to know the 39 forbidden categories of labor that are described in rabbinic literature, you just had to go out and you saw examples of all of it, as the Israelis were lighting fires and they were, doing all kinds of things. But, this is what they did on Shabbat.
So I just got to bring this up. When Nancy and I first got married in 1973, which is when the Yom Kippur War was, not
Right.
72.
Right, sorry, I made a mistake there.
Nancy and I joined a conservative synagogue in Livingston, and they announced on Yom Kippur the war.
Mhm.
And we were both shocked that, number one, the war occurred, and number two, the reaction of the congregation, which was, okay, like they weren't, maybe it was an old, obviously we were in our 20s and the congregation was 40s through 80s, which were more, I guess, towards Holocaust people, remembering those, that they
Mhm.
weren't as shocked as Nancy and I were. And so
Mhm.
that's the generation of that time versus the generation of what's happening now. I don't know if it has any relevance, but I just wanted.
I think it does. That's why I opened up by talking about my experience
Yeah,
and my generation. But I think there is this constant pull, and as Stan mentioned, that polarizing anything makes it difficult. The polarization of Sinai, oh Auschwitz. But much more what Kurtzer was trying to do, both in poking holes in each of those metaphors, but also trying to say there's got to be a balance.
right.
Because we can't. And Kurtzer mentioned this when someone raised the question about, aspirational Judaism is great, but what do we do when people are attacking us? And the famous joke of, just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean they are out. They aren't out to get me.
Right.
And we find ourselves very much in that experience today. For on one hand, we think of, well, just a couple of years ago, Pittsburgh.
Right.
On one hand, what a world of difference between that and Kristallnacht, where the police ran in to protect Jews, where there was a tremendous outpouring of concern and solidarity, even in Colleyville, just a couple of months ago, that it was just shock that people would that someone would go in and take hostages. The reality is that even after Pittsburgh, there have been all kinds of anti-Semitic incidents in Pittsburgh. And not long after the events at Colleyville, there were flyers and anti-Semitic material sent to the synagogue. And we can't forget the fact that one of the leaders of the Presbyterian Church got up on Martin Luther King Day, 2 days after the hostage event in Colleyville, and in talking about King's legacy, he had to speak about the horrible slavery that's taking place in Palestine. Not even a sensitivity to what had just happened. Not to mention that his facts are wrong, but it's hard to maintain our aspirational posture when in fact there are people who still hate us. And of course, today we are marking Yom HaShoah. And it's important that we mark Yom HaShoah.
Yeah.
And it's important that we put it out to the face of the world. On one hand, when my rabbi went to speak to, as I told you before, my rabbi was very close with many of the Christian clergy in town, and would very often be invited to speak in their churches. And in the 70s, a lot of what he spoke about was, to some extent, creating a sense of guilt over the Shoah, because Christians had to come to grips with what the role of Christian anti-Judaism was. Christians are very quick now to admit that. But what we need is, more people being able to support Jews and Judaism than just expressing their guilt. Because on one hand, none of the Christians alive today, well, I should say the overwhelming majority of Christians alive today had nothing to do with the Shoah. But the church as a whole, or Christianity as a whole, has a responsibility to remember the Shoah and what led up to it, and have a certain amount of sensitivity, just as today we argue that, and I personally don't feel any guilt about racism and slavery, because I wasn't there, and my family, even though they came before the Shoah, came, at the beginning of the 20th century, late 18th century, and probably had nothing to do whatsoever with the slave trade. But as an American, I feel responsibility for what are the elements of structural racism, what are, how are people of color still being treated. My ancestors had nothing to do with how we treated the Native Americans. But as an American, I feel responsibility. It's not so much guilt, but responsibility. At least I see there's a little bit of a difference.
There's also language. I can remember my father using slurs when I was a small child, but he quit at a point. And I'm sure everybody else's ancestors at some point or other were less than complimentary to other minority groups.
Yeah.
Yeah. But getting back to what the issue was, what are you suggesting that the Hebrew school teach as a way to maintain Judaism?
Good question.
In other words, I'm guessing you're not suggesting the Sinai or the Holocaust as a reason for existence. But,
right. Jewish education is such a complex issue today. Our Hebrew school is at this point merely a stopgap measure to try and instill some Jewish identity, whatever we can. We simply don't have enough hours. We pushed for a second day of Hebrew school, because when I came, there was only one day of Hebrew school. And frankly, even 2 days is ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's not. So, and also we're dealing with families that have like no experience of Judaism. We started talking about this years ago, that there was a time, and I think for most of us, when we went to Hebrew school, we were very often learning about what we did in our homes. Or at least there was something going on in our homes, observing holidays or Shabbat or whatever. And, or our parents went to synagogue, and we learned about that in Hebrew school. We learned about what was going on. Today, that doesn't go on. And what we have to do is provide just the scaffolding for people. So we've been focusing on Jewish experiences. So we've been doing, and Maddie, thank you for joining us last night. We have, like every other week, been doing Israeli dance with the kids to give them a taste of Israeli culture, to try and inculcate a little bit of Hebrew. It's really, we do cooking, which drives me crazy, because that's been like the 21st century method of Jewish teaching. We've got to do Jewish cooking. We don't do enough teaching about Judaism so they understand why we're doing this cooking or why we're eating what we're eating, but that's another story. But, we have to try and be as hands-on as possible. So we try and create Jewish experiences like the Shlufi Shabbat. Last summer when we had young families meeting us here in our backyard to do a little pre-Shabbat program. And, we're trying to teach some Hebrew. We're trying to teach a little bit about Judaism. And right now, most of our kids are too young really to talk about Yom HaShoah. There are also certain ages at which you can teach about Yom HaShoah. But as much as I believe in Yom HaShoah education, that really is for 8th grade and beyond, I believe. And we, even for our older class, when we had here Pam Chazen, who I still miss very much. She was a wonderful teacher in our Hebrew school. But one class that she was very interested in teaching was about the Shoah. And I think we had gotten to a point toward her concluding years where that's really not where we should be putting our emphasis. Not that we shouldn't be teaching it. And she certainly taught it well. But they got to know about Israel. God help us, some of these kids have got to know about Hanukkah. We also have more intermarried families. Although I have to say our intermarried families are pretty knowledgeable about Judaism. Sometimes our Jewish families. And it's not totally the parents' fault because they were often raised with nothing.
Mhm.
I remember I went out with someone, I was single when I went into the rabbinate, and I went out with someone in Kansas City. And she's a member of my congregation, so she knows darn well she's dating the rabbi. And at our first date, there were not a lot of kosher restaurants in Kansas City. In fact, there were 0. So I would eat parve or dairy out. And we went to a restaurant and she ordered crab rangoon. When I married Allison, she didn't keep kosher, but she would never in a million years think of ordering that. I don't even know if she likes it, but she would never in a million years think of doing something like that. There was just a sensitivity. There used to be a sensitivity about, certain practices. There was a time when people, would not keep their pens and pencils in their pockets when they came into Shabbat services. There was a time when people actually took off their phones before coming into Shabbat services. Now for security reasons, they tell us rabbis, you should be carrying telephones on Shabbat. It's a different world, but there were certain sensitivities that today just are not there. And, but it's hard because we also have to talk about Yom HaShoah because we're also in a period, and everyone is anxious about this, that we're losing our last survivors.
Yeah.
I tell my girls, and I'm, as you can tell, I'm not big on pushing Shoah, but I tell my girls, you are the last generation that is going to know Holocaust survivors. And not only are we losing Holocaust survivors, but with the rise in anti-Semitism, there is considerably more Holocaust denial, or I mean, that there even is Holocaust denial is mind-boggling. There's even an International Holocaust Remembrance Day. There are all kinds of countries, all kinds of European countries that have put up Holocaust memorials. That's a whole nother discussion, you know, and Kurtzer brings this up in his YouTube, like, should we be spending so much money on Holocaust memorials and not spending more money on Jewish education?
Right.
So, I mean, that's a serious issue, but nonetheless, there are people who are aware of the Shoah, and yet it's constantly being devalued. I don't know if anybody saw the Netflix series with Al Pacino about Nazi hunters.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I did.
The more I watched it, the more I realized how horrible it was.
Yeah.
Because it was a comic book. And not a comic book like Mouse, not a graphic novel, but it was in film form a comic book. And the characters were often terrible. And this is bad people, but they weren't so great either. But, you know, all of the serious issues that could be raised and the thoughtful reflection that needs to be raised, this is totally out the window. It was all about being entertainment, and yes, wonderful actors, but it was, I thought, horrible. So, you know, we have to do Holocaust education because unfortunately people don't understand it.
I just hope it continues. That's the only thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, they're still are they teaching it in public schools still?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
they are.
I remember
State mandate.
It's mandated in the state of New Jersey's mandated, I think, right? Yeah.
yeah. And in many parts of the country. So then I think there's some very, very good Holocaust education going on out there. But, you know, it's also hard to know, you know, when you have, is it Alabama or that they're trying to ban mouse, you know, along with, I mean, the big thing today is banning books.
I think it was Tennessee.
That was Tennessee.
Tennessee, yeah. So,
It's the same place as the Scopes trial.
right. Interesting. You know,
Florida's
so,
doing that too, in a sense.
yeah, I mean, you know, can we really imagine this? You know, we're almost at the end of the first quarter of the 21st century. And we're back to banning books.
Yeah.
So, no, but it's still a very serious issue for both, you know, Jewish educators, for Jews. You know, Kurtzer describes a very, very powerful sugya in the Talmud, where one sage is encountering a number of people who are mourning the temple, and they're not drinking wine, they're not eating meat. And I said, how can we do this? Wine was offered in the temple, meat was offered as the sacrifices. You know, we have to, you know, stop doing this. And he said, well, then, you know, you should stop drinking water, because they poured water where there was a ceremony of the water drawing in the temple. And he, you know, finally came up with stuff. They said, yeah, I guess we can't do that. You know, and he said to mourn over much is impossible. And there's stories again about people who are mourning too much. But to not mourn at all is also impossible. And I think that's something that we have to recognize. And, you know, I think that one of the things he points out is John Levinson, a biblical scholar at Harvard, does a course on the Jewish holiday cycle and how we balance sadness and joy throughout the year. And we have days that are sad, like Tisha B'Av. But that's not the whole calendar. We have Shabbat every week. We have minor fast days. We also have Purim and we have Chanukah. And really, it's only Purim and Hanukkah, the old joke that what are Jewish holidays? They tried to kill us. God saved us. Let's eat. It's really only Purim and Hanukkah. It doesn't really apply to our other holidays. Certainly doesn't apply to Shabbat. So, it's still a difficult issue that, just raises so many different ways in which we think about Judaism. And how do we live as Jews? Do we live only in fear of the other? Or do we live by our values? How are we supposed to live as Jews, not die as Jews? And that's, I think, a fundamental question for our people today. And living as Jews also means remembering.
Yeah.
We do have Yizkor, even on our happy holidays. And, so today is Yom HaShoah. Next significant date is Yom HaZikaron. We celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut, but Israel, very Jewish. We have Yom HaZikaron. We remember those who gave their lives to create the state of Israel, defense of the state of Israel, living in Israel. And then we move from Yom HaZikaron to the joy, to Yom HaAtzmaut, the reality of Israel. And, that's how we live as Jews.
Yeah, it was an excellent video. There were so many points. I was just saying that Talmud study that he was quoting about if we weep and grieve too much, we will mourn another. And I was just thinking for a Talmud class on suffering, if we could, maybe delve into a few of the sentences from the Talmud that I guess was Rambam, who he was
Rambam's not in the Talmud. Rambam is later.
No, later. I mean, but he was saying something like, there's a difference between foolishness and cruelty, that to not mourn is cruelty, but to mourn too much is foolishness.
Yeah.
And there were just so many good points in the thing.
Yeah, it was a brilliant, brilliant lecture.
Yeah, just too much to even talk about. And even at the end, I think he was quoting Amos Oz.
Yep.
If I don't, about the nation state and how he was really against loyalty to one nation and anthems and that kind of thing. And I mean, well, that struck me because I'm proud to be an American. If I hear the Pledge of Allegiance or if we win something, in the Olympics, you want to hear it, the anthem. But then when you start thinking about it, that we should be one world and not all this loyalty to one nation. There's just a lot of good things in it.
I mean, if you haven't seen the YouTube, watch it. It's really very, very good. And in general, I would recommend the Hartman podcasts. One, it comes from Hartman itself in Israel, with Yossi Klein Halevi and Daniel Hartman and Professor Hain. They very, very good reflections. But then there's another one done by Dr. Kurtzer, and I would highly, highly recommend the both of them. They've been really excellent and thoughtful. So thank you, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you, Rabbi.
Reminder, Parshat HaShavua tomorrow at noon, and then our regular schedule of services for Shabbat. Take care.
Bye-bye.